A group of precipitous islands with Norse names, Borroway, Soe, Doon, Hurta, together called St Kilda, though nobody really knows why, for there never was a saint of that name. A place that seabirds home into over the trackless ocean, hundreds of thousands of them. A place that provides all the food and nesting sites they need for birds like the gannet. This prince of plunge divers, with a great spear of a bill to suit his tactics, can dive into the sea headfirst from as much as 100 feet up. It's dramatic and successful. Here they nest only on the most inaccessible cliffs of all, on Borroway and its attendant stacks, nearly 50,000 breeding pairs of them. In spring, every available space is claimed, each nest owner just out of the pecking range of his neighbour. For though they nest in colonies, gannets are instinctively aggressive, and that's why the mated pairs spend so much time in courtship, simply getting to know each other. There are plenty of non-breeding birds around too. The younger birds, up to 3 or 4 years old, showing varying amounts of dark feathers on their wings and body. But gannets grow whiter with each molt, until at 4 or 5 years old they are fully adult and ready for breeding, like this mature bird. In spring, after weeks of displaying and courtship, the pair bond is strong enough for mating and the laying of their single egg, and the long period of incubation. The grand total, including the hangers-on, must be of the order of 100,000 birds, the largest colony in the world of the North Atlantic gannet. No wonder that by the end of the season the cliffs are whitened with their droppings. On Stack Lee alone, over 10,000 pairs nest on this 550-foot tooth of rock. And what a place in an Atlantic storm. Almost as numerous, and even more important in the island's history, is the fulmar, another oceanic species coming to land only to claim a nesting territory. And here on the cliffs of Hurta is the ideal place for them. If you go to the top of Conacher on Hurta and pick up a stone and throw it out hard on a clear trajectory, it has almost a quarter of a mile to fall, and it takes 12 long seconds to reach the sea. But the scale is almost impossible to comprehend, unless you go to the edge and look over at the criss-cross pattern of their flight, and listen to the babel of their calls, and smell the unforgettable smell that wafts up on a summer breeze. Fulmars are masters of the air, especially the upcurrents at the cliff edge. But on St Kilda, fulmars are more than aerial acrobats. They are the vital clue to man's place in the story of survival on this Atlantic outpost. To the people who lived here on St Kilda for perhaps 1,000 years, the fulmar was everything. Fulmar meat was their staple diet, eaten fresh, dried or salted down for the winter, and they paid their rent in feathers for feather beds. Life in the village must have been hard, but the St Kildans probably had the best protein diet in the Hebrides. The St Kilda Parliament met daily in the summer to decide on the programme of bird fowling for the day. In spring, guillemot's eggs took priority. But in July, the fowler donned his ropes, and with bare feet for a better grip and trusting to his incredibly well-developed ankles, and with his rope securely held by his anchorman at the top, he risked his life daily to harvest this unique crop, which brought him most of the necessities of life, even the oil which he took as a medicine or used to waterproof his boots. The men climbed down and snared the birds. The women and children carried them home to the village. The whole community shared out the harvest down by the shore. But all that was long ago. When the St Kildans left at their own request in 1930, only the starlings remained to nest in the ruins. When the people left, the house sparrows couldn't survive without man. But a snipe still creeps furtively to its nest amongst the irises in the old village street, its distinctive plumage pattern marking it out as a pharaoh snipe rather than the common snipe of the mainland of Scotland. The tumbled stones of an old 1830 black house make good shelter and a secure nest site for that lover of stony places, the wheatear, with his scratchy summer song. How adaptable wildlife can be. In 1957, when the army moved in to establish their radar station, the opportunist gulls soon began to cash in on man's return to the village, especially when in the early days the camp swill was tipped off the pier into the harbour. However, in that same year, 1957, the Nature Conservancy started work as guardians of St Kilda's National Nature Reserve, and it was soon realised that careless waste disposal could increase the gull population and upset the natural balance of St Kilda's wildlife. So strict controls were put on man's impact on the natural life, though the army showed great interest in the traditional wildlife assets of the island. Army life on St Kilda can be hard, so when a really fine day does come, everyone gets a day off to celebrate. When Village Bay is calm enough to show a clear reflection of Doon, the island which shelters Village Bay from the wild southwest, then even the Sergeant Major can go paddling. And there's always a chance to attempt a landing on Doon. By kind permission of the army, we hitch a lift in their dory. And it's only when you get out into the middle of Village Bay that you begin to get a true picture of just how many puffins there are. Doon is a truly remarkable island, as unspoiled as any in Europe. To start with, it may be the only sizable island in Britain not grazed by animals. For well over 50 years it has had no sheep, and in the moist Atlantic climate its vegetation is incredibly lush, with grass and sorrel almost knee-deep. Man seldom sets foot here, and the birds look surprised but unafraid. After a steep climb up the 45-degree slope, the rocky crest, decorated with a frieze of shags, drops hundreds of feet over storm-shattered rock to the sea below. It's rather a humbling experience to be virtually ignored by so many birds, like the hundreds of razorbills. We get the feeling that here they are the smart ones. The place teems with life, and its tremendous scale makes us feel very, very small. The turf is soft and springy and honeycombed with burrows, 60,000 of them occupied by nesting puffins, a figure only reached by Nature Conservancy researchers after many years of patient sampling and counting. To the old St Kildans, puffins were a resource to be harvested, and countless thousands were snared or snitched every year, mostly for their feathers. To us, their big, colourful beaks and webbed feet are attractive. To the St Kildans, they were just the right shape for trapping the birds in nooses or snares made of horsehair. The air seems alive with birds, an endless circuit of whirring wings, but you try counting them. Wherever you look, opposite every stretch of shore, the little white dots soon add up to hundreds, then thousands. Although the old accounts of millions of puffins darkening the sky may be exaggerated, we do know there was a fairly dramatic decline in the 1940s and 50s, especially on the main island of Herta. The numbers on Doon over 7 years of careful counting now seem very stable. The total population is probably still getting on for 400,000 pairs, so that when they have their young, there must be well over 1 million puffins at St Kilda in midsummer. Dwarfed by the scale of Doon and humbled by our experience, we make our way back to the landing place. It's time to go, for our boat is approaching across the great bowl of Village Bay, looking like a tiny water beetle on a pond. It's been quite a day. Yes, a visit to Doon is something of a privilege, for this is one of the great bird islands of Britain. If we're prepared to climb 1,000 feet over the ridge of the Mullach Scar, we can walk to Glen Bay on the west side of Herta, and the old ruined village of the Amazon's house, now occupied only by gulls. The chicks of the greater blackback gull look innocent enough at this stage. Their parents know how vulnerable they are and so never stray far from the nest. Yes, even the big gulls have enemies. The hoodie crow is a predator too, and eyes the gull chicks as a tasty breakfast. But a greater blackback is a powerful enemy, with a beak that can turn a puffin inside out and swallow it whole. To her, the hoodie is a menace, so she launches into the attack. But crows are intelligent and adept flyers, and can outmaneuver the gull any day. This one does a victory roll and a power dive to prove it. And meanwhile, all this activity has spilled over into the territory of a pair of gaudy oyster catchers. Trusting in the subtle camouflage of their pebble-sized eggs, the birds use their black and white show colours to intimidate even the big gulls. Oyster catchers are noisy and aggressive, and here they're playing on their home ground, so to speak, and so are even more full of confidence and fight. The gull, for all its superiority in size, retires back to its own territory, and the oyster catcher's eggs are still safe and sound. The eider duck is also protected by camouflage, not by the colour of her eggs, but her own soft plumage, as she sits snug on her eider down. And that's the exact opposite of this bright visitor all the way from the Mediterranean, a painted lady butterfly, incongruously gaudy and fragile in this environment, as it feeds on the sea pinks at the cliff edge. A migrant butterfly's chances of survival here are small, but the oystercatcher is superbly adapted to life on a sea-girt island. As she settles on her nest on the floor of the ruins of the factor's store, she is, however, unaware of a new danger. Her mate arrives to land on the chimney, a kind of lookout post above the nest, just as a pair of ravens arrive from the west cliffs, searching the village area for food for their own young already well fledged. The guard is alert to the danger, for the raven is the most powerful member of the crow family, with a massive beak that could easily crush the skull of an oystercatcher. But he never gets the chance, and soon retreats before the noisy onslaught of both birds at once. A German U-boat destroyed this store in May 1918 in an attack on the naval wireless station, and now it's just one of 50 nesting places for oystercatchers on Herta. In the early days, National Trust work parties stored their food in disused cleats, the stone sheds designed by St Kildans to store hay and peat. But the St Kilda mice were there too, and the cooks very quickly found you couldn't keep porridge oats in cardboard boxes. But this is no ordinary mouse. It's still a field mouse, Apodemus sylvaticus, often known as the wood mouse in Britain from its woodland habitat. But this is an island race, Hertensis, the field mouse of Herta, not found anywhere else in the world. It is distinctive on measurements, but perhaps more on its behaviour, being rather tamer than mainland mice. It is, however, basically still a very timid creature, as you can see. And so too is the St Kilda wren, another island subspecies unique to St Kilda, a little larger and more boldly marked than mainland wrens, and feeding here in the village amongst the stones of the dry burn, which occasionally runs with a trickle of water in wet weather. And what better place for a wren to nest than in the bone-dry shelter of a cleat up under the roof? All wrens are troglodytes, creeping about more often than flying. The hen will often approach the nest inside the thickness of the walls, completely hidden until the last moment. The main job of the male wren is to defend the territory in which he has built several nests, one of which the hen eventually selects and lines with feathers for her eggs. He sings to declare his presence and warn off rival males who may well sing back in defiance. But it's all show and they seldom fight. The female is more domesticated and during incubation only leaves the nest briefly to venture out for food. When the young hatch, life changes dramatically, and both birds spend most of the day searching for food and carrying back insects to their brood. Probably about 250 pairs of wrens live on St Kilda, a figure reached only by counting the singing males as they sit like this on prominent songposts in early summer. And alongside is St Kilda's third island speciality, the Soay sheep. This is the most primitive sheep of Europe, probably the type of domestic sheep originally introduced into Scotland as much as 3,000 years ago by Neolithic man. Many of the ewes are horned and they have coarse wool intermediate between goat hair and the softer wools of the more domestic breeds, and they cast it naturally in summer. Big horns are also a feature of these Soay sheep, the descendants of about 100 brought off the island of Soay 2 years after the evacuation, and now living as a feral flock on Herta. They have their own patterns of behaviour, with much sparring between the young rams. They're as near to a wild flock of sheep as you can find anywhere. They go entirely unshepherded, but since 1957 they've been intensively studied for the Nature Conservancy. About 1,500 sheep feed on these incredibly steep pastures. It's been a unique opportunity for a long-term study. What are the natural forces controlling an isolated wild population of large mammals? A scientist throws down a wooden square at random, representing 1 square foot of available pasture. Inside, he snips off all the edible fodder, to be taken back to the laboratory for drying and weighing. The sheep have no competitors, so he can assess accurately all the nutrients available to them. And when he has measured the available pasture, he can then work out how many sheep it should sustain. And what they've discovered is that the population rises and falls between 500 and 2,000 in roughly a 5-year cycle. The numbers controlled by starvation in early spring. It's the old story: breed now, pay later. It's a lesson perhaps that man on his own island habitat of planet Earth should learn for his own survival. Looking across 4 miles of open Atlantic to Borroway, we can reflect on how man himself survived on St Kilda for over 1,000 years. And the secret was, of course, the harvest of seabirds. And part of that harvest was, believe it or not, the great gannetry of Borroway. Here on Herta there were no gannets nesting, and the only evidence you have of them is their daily fly-past through Soay Sound, past the great cliffs of the Canberra, heading for the Atlantic fishing grounds. The St Kilda men knew that their one chance of this harvest was in the calmest weather of July and August, when they would take to their boats and make that risky 4-mile journey across to the stacks. And one main target was Stack Lee, a dangerous landing and a formidable climb. Each pair of gannets rears only 1 chick, fattened on a rich diet of seafood, from a near-naked nestling through a downy white stage to the fat, full-grown cougar. The St Kilda tradition was to kill what they called the sentinel bird first, under cover of darkness. Otherwise the first man ashore might only set the whole colony in a panic, and many birds would be lost, especially the adults. But on a successful expedition to Stack Lee, thousands of birds could be killed and thrown down to the boats waiting below. Gannets were literally easy meat. Yes, the sea is the controlling factor at St Kilda. Here, it has carved a hole through an entire headland, leaving a tunnel with a roof as high as a cathedral, through which the swell surges. Here, Atlantic grey seals play in the surf, and since the evacuation have come increasingly to give birth to their pups in the autumn, in caves and on remote boulder beaches. Here too nest some of the other seabirds which make use of the safety of the cliffs as inaccessible breeding places. Guillemots, whose eggs once provided another rich harvest, are noisy and quarrelsome ledge breeders. And the gentle kittiwakes, named after their cries, one of the most evocative sounds in nature. All these seabirds and their young thrive on the bountiful ocean, so rich in food that in late summer, when all the young are being fed as well, I have estimated that at St Kilda 1.5 million seabirds take over 160 metric tons of fish food daily from the surrounding seas. Yes, 160 tons. There are some newcomers too. In 1963 the great skua arrived from the far north and has increased to about 25 pairs. They're aggressive in defence of their nests and will swoop at your head and strike you if you're not careful. But most fascinating of all are the night birds, nesting chiefly on the great talus slopes of the Carn Moor. To see these, you must climb down amongst the tumble of boulders at night. Only when it is really dark will these oceanic species come to land to home in to their underground burrows on the individually recognized voices of their mates. They call first in fright to make contact, flitting past our heads like moths caught in the lamplight. There goes the bird we're specially looking for, Leach's fork-tailed petrel. The sitting bird calls to its mate like an animated clockwork toy right under our feet. That's the flight call, underground. The conversation from the burrow stops abruptly as we reach a hand in to find the sitting bird. And now another pair has started calling nearby. Not much bigger than a house martin and with a similar pale rump, the Leach's petrel has a strange musky smell. With its long sickle-shaped wings, it's perfectly adapted for long-distance flight over the sea, but it's terribly vulnerable on land. Look at that prominent tubular nostril on top of the bill, a feature of all the petrel family. Leach's fork-tailed petrel is one of Britain's least-known birds, first discovered at St Kilda as late as 1818. It nests on all 5 of the islands and the group in large numbers, quite impossible to estimate, but certainly in hundreds. Much better known from its many other breeding sites in Britain is the Manx shearwater, which has only a few small colonies on St Kilda. It's a much larger bird with a formidable beak, best kept well away from the fingers. They too nest underground and locate their mates in the dark with their weird wailing calls. And next morning, there's nothing at all to be seen or heard of Carn Moor's dramatic nightlife, now all hidden away underground. But the Sowie sheep are still there, a relic of man's part in the story of one of Europe's least spoiled, most natural wilderness areas. Sowie itself, separated from Herta by this narrow sound, is the westernmost point of Britain, a symbol of inaccessibility. But Borreray and the Stacks remain the most dramatic. And the paradox of St Kilda can be seen in the wild flock of black-faced sheep placed on Borreray by the islanders to graze its fertile green slopes, and still thriving unshepherded over 50 years later. Yes, there are lessons to be learned on St Kilda, and not just how to protect your food supplies from the mice, but lessons in conservation, as the National Trust for Scotland has shown in caring for the ruined village, so full of voices from the past. Lessons about man's failure to cope and nature's ability to survive. Can we, as inhabitants of planet Earth, perhaps learn to live as the St Kildans once did, not in conflict with nature, but in harmony with our environment?